Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Julia Cooke's newest book, Come Fly the World, the Jet Age Story of the Women of Pan Am, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is a sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers, authors like Julia and Catherine, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of it. So, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Julia Cooke for the launch of her newest book, Come Fly the World. Julia Cooke's journalism has been published in Time, Smithsonian, and Condé Nast Traveler. She's the author of The Other Side of Paradise, Life in the New Cuba, and the daughter of a former Pan Am executive. Joining Julia in conversation is Catherine Grace Katz. Catherine is a writer and historian from Chicago. She graduated from Harvard in 2013 with a BA in history and received her Master's of Philosophy in Modern European History from Christ's College, University of Cambridge in 2014, where she wrote her dissertation on the origins of modern counterintelligence practices. After graduating, Catherine worked in finance in New York before a very fortuitous visit to the bookstore in the lobby of her office in Manhattan led her to return to history and writing. She's currently pursuing her JD at Harvard Law School. The Daughters of Yalta is her first book. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Julia and Catherine to the stage.
Thanks, Severe. Julia, it's so exciting to speak with you tonight. I loved your book, Come Fly the World. It's terrific. I've been so looking forward to this conversation. We all think of the jet age in the terms of Mad Men and Glamour, but really it's so much more than that. And your book is a perfect example of how the Hollywood portrayal of this jet age, belies the amazing stories that are true, which was so exciting to read about in your book. And before we get started, I know that there are also a few members of flight crews who maybe worked for Pan Am or another airline who are joining us this evening. So if you are one of these people, please say in the chat, say hello, introduce yourself, let us know who you flew with. And it's so exciting to have you join us as part of this conversation. So Julia, great to meet you. So excited to be here.
So great to meet you too, Catherine.
So I loved your book because it shows a side of the story, of course, told by women, but also gives a very complex view of geopolitical events, culture, and the way that they all merge together, especially from a perspective that's one that we don't often see. But before we get into the story and some of the details of it that I just loved reading, I'd love to know a little bit more about you and growing up as part of the Pan Am family, as you say, and how being part of that family led you to write this book.
So it was a really interesting way to grow up. My dad had worked for Pan Am until I was 9, which was when the airline went under. But I really hadn't thought that much about the airline other than the conversations that we would have reminiscing about the good old days. It hadn't been something that I'd considered as part of what I wanted to write about. In the thinking about writing about this book, I realized the outsized influence that Pan Am actually did have on my life, but I can get to that more later. So the book came about because I went to an event that the Pan Am Historical Foundation held at the TWA terminal in New York at JFK. Pan Am's own terminal was torn down some years ago, but the TWA terminal still exists, and it's gorgeous. If anyone has a chance to get there, it's a hotel now. It's stunning. And I met these two beautiful, wonderful, really sophisticated and smart, but more than that, women who were they were so informed about history. They spoke about former, events of world history and geopolitics with this level of deep intimacy. Later, I realized that this was not that unusual. That a lot of these former flight crew really do have that level of knowledge and et cetera. I also, over the course of researching the book, really came to see my time growing up in Pan Am a little bit differently. It kind of made me a journalist or a writer in a way. I grew up, my mom would pack us for hot or cold, and we would go to the airport and get on whatever plane had 4 free seats. It was a really fun and weird way to grow up. Every weekend, basically every long weekend somewhere else. And it made me really excited. It made me accustomed to being around people that I didn't necessarily understand, whose language I didn't speak. It made me a little more observant, I think. I read a lot on planes and in airports. So it did contribute hugely.
That's great. And I'd just like to remind people listening in the audience that if you have a question, we will be taking many of your questions in the Q&A portion a little bit later. So please write your questions in at any time using the Ask the Question function at the bottom of your screen. Really excited to hear what everybody is thinking and excited about. But for now, I'll ask a few more questions. So I would love to situate where we are in history with this story. What made Pan Am unique? How did they get to become the world famous airline that we know about them today? And what was their connection to global events, especially things like the Vietnam War?
Yeah, so Pan Am was an airline of firsts. It was the first American airline to operate permanent international flights in the 1920s, to use radio to serve meals in the air. It was the first to operate scheduled transatlantic passenger service in the 30s. In the 1940s, it was the first to run around the world flight, and those flights were linked by its involvement in World War II, its contributions to the war effort via the Lend-Lease Act and via the aid that it offered in creating airports across Africa in order to defend from Hitler coming across. They feared that he could come from Senegal to Brazil, which is only 1,000 some miles, and thereby invade. So Pan Am had always been involved with the U.S. government from the beginning. Juan Trippe, the CEO and founder, was very keen on being what he called the chosen instrument, which meant the instrument of the national interest, as close to a flag carrier, which is a nationalized airline, as you can get.
That's great. Well, the story of Lend-Lease and its impact on the war effort, even before the United States entered the war, that's something that I'm so interested in, having spent a lot of time writing about Averell Harriman, who was the Lend-Lease envoy in London. That was a crucial part of the war effort, and his daughter Kathleen Harriman made it over to London with him during the war via the Pan Am Clipper. So I saw Pan Am in action in my own research. So when you started your research, we, I think, have a partial view of the role of stewardesses, especially working for Pan Am, which doesn't completely tell the whole story. And having grown up in the Pan Am family, you definitely knew more about what the real experience was like, more than somebody else who may never have flown Pan Am, maybe wouldn't have been thinking about what it was like to work for an airline. But what, even with that background that you had from childhood, can you tell us what surprised you the most, kind of between the perception versus the reality of stewardesses working in this field as you began your research?
Yeah, even from the very beginning, just the level of keen involvement and excitement about the world, but also what was happening behind the scenes around the world. That was one of the first things that I was surprised by. I think I'd always known that these women were interesting, but I had not been able to put my finger on how or why. And really, the more research I did, the more I realized that that basically the public perception of the job of international stewardess was really hijacked by the book Coffee to Your Me and the many pop cultural phenomena that followed, from movies to comics to anything else, to advertising with the actual airlines themselves, not Pan Am, but other airlines. It really came to overshadow the actual and real things that these women did, but also attitudes that they had. Sure, some of Coffee to Your Me really painted women of that era, stewardesses, as being interested in shopping and dating men and finding a husband. And certainly these were, for the most part, not women who didn't like to shop or wouldn't go on a date if the moment if it was right. But that wasn't by any stretch their primary reason for flying or what they were excited about necessarily. There was a lot more to it. They were a lot more complex.
Absolutely. These are women who had degrees in science, literature, foreign languages, spoke many languages. Many of them held graduate degrees. This is a really sophisticated group of women who were widely interested in the world and in many subjects that kind of intersected with the airline and travel industry and foreign relations as well, which is a huge part of an airline business, where you're naturally going to have your product that you provide butting up against certain geopolitical conflicts that change and emerge over the life of your company. But let's talk a little bit about some of the women that you focus on in particular in the book. There are 5 women that you really profile, 3 of them in particular. So I would love to know, how did you decide, of all the thousands of stewardesses who had worked in this industry, which ones in particular that you wanted to focus on to illustrate the experience of what it was like working as a woman during the jet age?
Yeah, I found myself really interested in the Vietnam War flights. To me, there was nothing that more succinctly demonstrated the differences between the pop culture, notion of what a stewardess was and what she really was, which was, in many cases, it was a really dangerous role. They were on the front lines of history. They were on the front lines of a war. And a lot of them really relished being on the front lines of history. Certainly, many of them did not relish being on the front lines of the war, but they took their role really seriously. So to me, there was nothing that more clearly demonstrated the contrast between the glamour of the job and the grit and the really dangerous things than the war. So I knew from like a year or so in of talking to a lot of basically crashing their parties. I would go to their luncheons and conventions and just say hi and try to meet people. And everyone had someone else that they said, oh, you have to meet so-and-so. They have a fantastic story about, et cetera, whatever. And then I would meet so-and-so, and her story about whatever would indeed be really incredible. And I would meet more and more people. So I decided from, relatively early on that I wanted the Vietnam War flights to be pretty central. And then I met 2 women who had worked the Operation Babylift flight, which I found fascinating. And again, really incredibly emblematic of the role that these women played and the kind of everyday heroism. I don't like the term heroism, it's not something I really, the term itself kind of gets to be bigger than anything else. But it's true. These were, women who were put in a really dangerous position, asked to do something that was very, very far beyond the purview of what they thought they would be doing, flying into an active war zone and chasing up after a deadly crash to bring children out of Saigon. But anyway, the point is that I met 2 of the 3 women, and I wanted to find a third. And I also understood that there were other stories that those women would not tell. And so I really wanted to profile someone who had spent a lot of time in Moscow. And I also really wanted to profile a Black stewardess, because this was the era in which the airlines were integrated also. I wanted to know more about that. I wanted to follow a woman who had made it into management, and someone who had lived in Hong Kong, and miraculously 2 really dynamic, interesting women encompassed all 4 of those remarkable experiences.
That's great. So I know from my own research, you can pull from a variety of types of sources, and I love to talk to other writers and historians about their research process, which can be really different depending on the type of history you're telling, the era in which you're working. So my book, The Daughters of Yalta, covers the Yalta Conference at the end of World War II, 1945. It's the story of Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Ambassador Averell Harriman, and their daughters who joined them at the conference as their aides. And so it's not ancient history by any means, and we do have a huge amount of documents, personal letters that the daughters wrote, some of which I was the first person to be able to go through to tell their story, being not only young women on the forefront of history between, on the precipice between World War and Cold War, but also illuminating what it was like, for the world leader, these great men of history to be your dad. So, I had these great resources to draw on, beautiful letters that they wrote, scrapbooks, photographs, newsreels, but I didn't get to talk to any of the women themselves. The last of them passed away in 2011. And sadly, I was still in college at the time. I didn't even know I would be writing this story someday. But I was able to talk to people who knew them and loved them more than anyone, their children, nieces and nephews, colleagues, even got to interview one of Churchill's secretaries, one of Anna Roosevelt's children who was a teenager at the time of Yalta. So people who had fresh memories of that period, but it's a little bit different than interviewing the subjects themselves. And even just getting to know the families, that is a journey in and of itself, and kind of earning the trust of the people that you're interviewing, who you're asking them to share their stories with you. And I find that to be a really special part of the experience. But for you, you got to actually speak with your subjects, conduct oral histories and interviews with them. So can you tell us a little bit about what it was like, kind of, so you make contact with them, you meet some of them at the functions that you're attending, you stay in touch with them, you learn that their stories intersect the aspects of this world that you want to portray. So what's it like then, going and interviewing them? Did you go to their homes? Did they come and meet you somewhere? Did you take any trips with them? I would love to know all about how you got all these amazing memories into this book.
All of the above. So I felt really strongly from the beginning of thinking about writing this book that I wanted the oral history, I wanted the actual experiences of these women to guide the research. There have been a number of good books written about the jet age and the era's contribution to the American industrial complex, the aviation industrial complex of the middle 20th century. There have been books. There's been a really good academic book about stewardesses' contributions to the feminist movement, in particular via the legal struggles. So there have been a couple of books about the aviation industry in the jet age and stewardesses a little bit, but very few of them, none of them, really talked about the experiences of the women themselves and what flying meant to them, what they had actually done, why they'd done it, how their lives were impacted by this unprecedented freedom that they were living, and within constraints. The airlines, only a certain kind of woman was hired, 5'3" to 5'9", a certain weight. I really wanted the oral history, the interviews to guide the archival and secondary source research, which is what I did. I would interview them, often in person at their homes or over the phone, FaceTime. Lynne and I had a standing every Friday afternoon FaceTime engagement. We would talk, and I would ask her the same thing. This is over the course of like 3 or 4 months, and I would ask her to tell me the same scene over and over and over again from like a lot of different angles, and I would do research in between, and then I would, we did travel together sometimes. I went to Norway with Tori, which was great fun, and her best friend Diane, who might be in the audience. So they were all really generous and excited to talk to me about about what I mentioned to you earlier, off in the green room, that most of these women had been asked a lot about the celebrities that they'd served in flight, or where they bought the best shoes, or these slightly more the moments of history that were fun, but they might not have spoken a ton about the more grave, or the more dangerous, or the more the more poignant moments. So most of them were very excited to be talking about that.
That's great. I noticed somebody just mentioned in the questions, and thank you very much for writing in, that the audio is maybe a little bit difficult to hear on your end, Julia. So if you could be a little bit closer to the microphone.
Got it.
Awesome, great. So give us a thumbs up in the chat if that's working better for you. Did you find when you were interviewing the women that you were talking to, were there aspects of their experience that maybe they, I found when I was learning about the daughters at the Yalta conference, they kind of didn't speak about their experiences much in the years after the war, largely because of this wartime humility of I was just doing my part. It was no more important than anyone else. And they almost didn't realize how vital their role had been. And so did you find while you were interviewing these remarkable women that there were some things that they maybe didn't realize were as amazing as we know they are today, just because they're humble that this was just part of their job? Or were there any aspects of it that were maybe really difficult, and you go through some harrowing episodes, a few of which I want to get to in a minute, that might have been hard to talk about initially, but as your relationship with them developed over time, and they became more comfortable speaking with you, that they revealed different things that maybe they may not have wanted to talk about initially?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes to both. There was a huge amount of I was just doing my job. There were some of the scenes that I heard about were incredibly dangerous. These women were put in very dangerous positions in many times. And to them, it just never would have occurred to many of them to be afraid. And it certainly never would have occurred to them to quit their jobs. And there, I did hear, of course, this is a self-selecting group. I was going to the events of the women who had flown for a fair amount of time. So I didn't meet the women who may have quit. And there were a couple I did hear about, women whose roommates said, no, thank you, after one flight into Saigon, and then found another job. But the women that I was meeting were not those women. One of the things that had first really impressed me about them was, to me, they had really anticipated a number of global movements. They were flying in a moment when the feminist movement was starting to really gain steam. They were flying amid the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, and the anti-war protest movement, and their experiences reflected all of those different movements in different ways. So I was really fascinated by the ways that interacted with their lives, and the choices that they made, and the way that they felt what flying meant to them. And that was not something that I don't think that to them they were just doing their job. That was certainly the dominant response to that.
That's great. It's definitely just so emblematic of a different generation where that humility was really paramount, and it's not just the wartime greatest generation, but their children as well. I think really had that sense of humility and service, and doing your bit and the best way that you can. And I think that's something that's really lovely to think about in our life and times today, where everything moves so quickly, and if you're not the loudest voice, no one will hear you. But it was a different time that's not so far away, and it's refreshing to dive back into that. So one of the things that I'm dying to ask you about, kind of just thinking about a sense of place as it contributes to a story, and the experience of being a young woman in an unusual place. It's far away from home, which was certainly the case for all of these women at all times during the course of their jobs. But so throughout my research, I was able to learn a lot about Kathleen Harriman, the daughter of the American ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averil Harriman, who had overseen Lend-Lease and then became in London, and then became the American ambassador in Moscow. His daughter came with him as his aide. She was in her early 20s, learned to speak Russian for both of them, and really became his assistant ambassador in many ways. And I was just astounded to learn that she was the American woman who had more access to and experience with Stalin and his inner circle than any other American woman in history. And she was just hiding in plain sight. But what was so interesting as I was reading her letters was she would describe Moscow and daily life. And on the one hand, she arrived in Moscow expecting it to be dilapidated, full of cold, unsmiling people. But that wasn't what she found. There was rich culture and beauty and music and ballet. But yet there was many juxtapositions where kind of the surface was not reflective of what lay just beneath. She would walk past shops where there were beautiful displays in the windows, but you'd go into the shop and there was nothing to buy. Or people seemed to be in a perpetual rush, and they'd be rushing to get in line for something, or to catch a tram, or what have you, rushing everywhere, but also rushing to nowhere. Mm-hmm. And she also found herself kind of stared at, as someone who was very obviously American, very obviously not from Moscow, as she's learning Russian, kind of standing there on the street corner practicing the language as she's just kind of mumbling to herself as she's walking along, and people are staring at her like this curiosity with her silk stockings and fur coat, which is not something that people, everyday Russians or Soviets had at the time. So you take us through the experience of one of your characters in particular, Hazel Bowie, who found herself working one of the routes that Pan Am opened to Moscow during the Cold War, which I thought was fascinating, and about her very unique experience of being not only an American woman, but an African-American woman in Moscow at the height of the Cold War as a Pan Am stewardess and what that meant. So I'd love to hear more about Hazel.
Hazel was fascinating to talk to. Again, talk about someone who really didn't have she had no puffed up image of how incredible her experiences were. She just enjoyed flying to Moscow because she was from Minnesota and was not intimidated by the cold. And so she liked it. She felt like, the things that she saw in Moscow were unlike anything that she would see anywhere else. And that sense of difference really appealed to her, especially interspersed within other routes. She would go to Rome, and then she would go to Germany for a while, and she was based in New York, so her flights were mostly European. And then she'd go to Moscow, and she loved the people that she would meet on the planes. They were mostly journalists and diplomats, with the occasional refugee coming to the U.S., or people who had not seen their families for a very long time, and they had access to travel. She really enjoyed. It felt to her like the things that she was doing, I think, were subversive, when in reality they were different. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it was really interesting to me to hear about what she was saying, and I couldn't help but think that that her experience, her lack of intimidation of Moscow was also intertwined with, her being among the first African-American stewardesses on the airline in general. She was not someone who was easily intimidated, but in a very casual way. She wasn't pushing her way through anything.
Yeah, well, it's incredible to think about, these young women in their 20s and 30s. And I don't know if it kind of, you stepped out of the story for a second and, started to imagine what would it have been like, if you had been there at the time. I know certainly you never want to write yourself into the story, but I was 27 while I was working on the bulk of the research for this. Kathleen Harriman is 27 at the time. She was at the Yalta conference with her father, being asked to get up and give a toast in Russian in front of Stalin, and just what that would have meant to be a young woman coming of age in this fraught time, in a place that's so far away and really so misunderstood or poorly understood to people at home, and what a singular experience that would be. You mentioned the Pan Am stewardesses who flew to Moscow would often have their belongings searched by Soviet minders. That's something that's been going on throughout history. At the Yalta conference, espionage abounded. Everything was bugged. There were doctors at the airfield incognito trying to see if FDR was actually ill, with the rumors that had been swirling. People would say, a twist of lemon would be great with caviar, and magically overnight a lemon tree would appear, in the middle of a war zone, this luxury no one would expect. And that theme seems to still, have stayed constant, even 30 years later, about the time that you're writing about, with the stewardesses who felt somewhat uncomfortable, not too uncomfortable that they wouldn't do it, but certainly concerned enough to maybe want to wear their uniform while walking around Moscow as a type of protection.
Yeah, and again, what I found so remarkable was the way that they just kind of took it for granted, and the way that they really were committed to having fun with it almost. There was a woman who told me about playing Shake the KGB on the underground, on the subway. They would, they knew their minders were following them, and they would jump onto a train and try to lose their minders. I heard about all the games that they would play with those that surveillance. And to me, that strikes me as something that really only a 20-something woman would do. I in my late 30s probably wouldn't do that anymore, but who knows, maybe. It takes a certain level of nonchalance to engage with that level of espionage or surveillance in such a playful manner.
Absolutely. And I mean, the boldness and fearlessness is something that is that maybe one loses somewhat as they mature and realize the risks. But you had these young women who were putting themselves in great physical danger, especially the flights associated with the Vietnam War, the R&R flights, but in particular, of course, Operation Babylift, which you tell us about in the climax of your story. It is the story that brings these remarkable women's intersecting lives together for this remarkable moment. See Karen, Lynne, and Tori all working on the same crew, part of the same flight. And so can you tell us a little bit about the background behind Operation Babylift and how these fearless women found themselves in the middle of it?
Yes, so Operation Babylift happened in April of 1975. The war was ending, and the North Vietnamese were about to come into Saigon. There's a book called The Life We Were Given by Dana Sachs, which was, it's a much more comprehensive history of the Babylift than I was going to write, because what I was interested in was the stories of the women who were flying in. The Babylift itself, President Ford committed to bringing back 2,000 orphans from Saigon, many of whom were the children of American GIs in Vietnam. The rumor was that half American, half Vietnamese children would be killed by the Viet Cong as soon as they came in. And so mothers were terrified. They were leaving their children at orphanages, unclear whether they were leaving them there permanently or in hopes of coming back and getting them a little bit later. And that kind of disorganization held through the whole event itself. It was a really complicated moment in history. It was an incredibly complicated event or incident, which is, but what I was interested in was the fact that these women there was a crew of a flight crew that was in Hong Kong and was told, you're going to fly into Saigon tomorrow. The American flight that was intended to be the first flight of Operation Babylift, which was a U.S. Air Force plane, C-5A Galaxy cargo plane, had crashed the day before, or the day that the women were told that they were going to be flying into Hong Kong, or into Saigon from Hong Kong. And so I really was fascinated by just that moment of being in a hotel in Hong Kong. As a woman they were all in their early 30s at that point. They'd been flying for quite some time. They'd all had really remarkable, dangerous history-making experiences. But in that moment, they were told that they were going to be taking this incredible risk. And all they knew was that 300-odd children needed to be brought out of Saigon. So, and I was really, really engaged by what made them say yes. A couple of the women decided not to fly that flight. You couldn't be forced to do something like that. So they chose not to. But the women that I was profiling all said yes.
That's remarkable. I mean, reading that chapter, I mean, I felt the tension every page, the sense of concern that you can't help but have that trepidation, and yet overcoming that trepidation to feel like you're part of something important. Even as the narrative around Vietnam is changing in the United States, people are very frustrated with the war, feel that it has been an unnecessary loss of life. People who participated, servicemen, very sadly, were really kind of left to they weren't appreciated for what they had done. They were trying to serve their country, and yet the public opinion about the war didn't mean that they always were treated with the respect that they deserved. Following orders and being sent somewhere as a young man, you have no control of your life, and these women, they volunteered right alongside the men to step in and play a vital role, even as the tone around Vietnam was shifting. And so it's pretty courageous, I think, what you detail of not only did they were willing to sacrifice themselves and put themselves at great personal risk in support of saving these children, which was so important. Many of them orphans, of course. But also then knowing some of the backlash that was coming at home as well. Mm-hmm. Would be a legacy that would have mixed implications for them in the years to come. So I don't know if any of them shared their thoughts with you after the fact about how they felt about Vietnam and their part in it, later on as public opinion really, turned against them and what they had done?
It wasn't even after the fact. A lot of the women had really, really ambivalent feelings about participating in the war effort from the beginning. The women that the unifying thing was that they all understood the gravity of what they were doing. Some felt very strongly that they wanted to contribute to the war effort. They thought that they had more hawkish political perspectives, and they believed that the war was an important war against communism in the Cold War. Others were active in the anti-war protest movement from the beginning. They did not think that the U.S. had any business being in there at all. And they were surprised when they were assigned to fly into Vietnam. And the one unifying thing was that they all really agreed that they felt very keenly that the passengers on their plane deserved the utmost dignity. That the men didn't necessarily want to be there either, and that that their feelings about the war they could protest in their off time, and some of them did. But in that moment in flight, their passengers deserved every bit of dignity and levity that they could offer. So that carried through for the Babylift as well, in a different way. They felt very keenly that they wanted to, that any comfort that they could offer to scared children who were being sent far away from home was something that was something they wanted to do.
Great. So one thing that I find fascinating in thinking about the history of diplomacy and unlikely actors who are participating in diplomacy, even in a way that is not kind of working as a State Department official or, a Foreign Office official if you are in Britain. But there are many different instruments of diplomacy and ways of advancing American interests around the world, or whatever country you come from, your country's national interest. And sometimes this is called soft diplomacy. And I think that people have a tendency occasionally to conflate soft diplomacy to kind of female diplomacy, that soft implies female, but that's not necessarily the case. And we certainly had women in the war that were actively involved in many aspects of the military, of women of the resistance. But soft diplomacy is instead of thinking about it kind of in gendered terms, it's also something that corporations do. So soft diplomacy really being the unofficial ways in which a country spreads its values around the world. Pan Am seemed to be a fantastic tool that the American government had working not necessarily at its behest, but in line with its objectives and desire to spread American values and ways of life around the world. So I'd just love to hear a little bit more about, having written this book and learned about these women, individuals as actors involved in soft diplomacy, and as a company that is part of the huge part of the story of American power, projecting power during the Cold War. After having written this, what are your takeaways about the power of soft diplomacy around the world?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. So I had not known until researching this book the degree to which Pan Am was intertwined with the projection of American power abroad throughout the 20th century. And there's a remarkable book by a scholar named Jennifer Van Ness, who wrote about that. And I think it was there that one of the quotes in my book, which is that at some point Pan Am was more recognizable around the world than Coca-Cola was, which is strange for us, in this current moment to remember. But it's true that as I read about the installations that Pan Am had in various countries, they were these huge. They were comparable to U.S. Army forces, bases in different countries. So on a formal diplomacy level, that was huge. On a much softer level, you wrote in The Daughters of Yalta about Kathy as a protocol officer, as the person who's making sure that everything is moving smoothly, and you're not going to be recognized for that. That you're only going to be called out if that doesn't go well. But that kind of seamless, smooth movement through an experience of an important diplomatic moment in history, it's really important to the formal diplomacy that's happening. And that's what I found with these women as well, that a lot of them, that the people who were on their flights were incredibly important people, or they were people who were in really vulnerable moments of their lives. They were leaving the Soviet bloc for new homes in the West. They were orphan children who had been in a plane crash the day before. They were either engaged in formal diplomacy or they were not. And for the women to be providing a seamless experience, they were the protocol officers of the air.
Absolutely. I mean, protocol and diplomacy, so much of it is about, an unsung role, because when you do your job well, it goes unnoticed. It's, the whole point, that it is seamless, that, cultural confusion is minimized, that you can work with people whose experiences are wholly unlike your own, kind of within a set of parameters that make it comfortable to conduct business in an international way. So it is, really unsung heroes who make the operations work perfectly. And it is only when there's a mistake that, they are then criticized, but usually not complimented and commended for the great work that they do. So now that we have the story of these women out in the open, thanks to you and your great research, have you talked to any of the women that you interviewed, or their friends and colleagues that you've gotten to know along the way? Even just in the last week and a half that the book has been out, I'd love to know what your reactions are, what their reactions have been. And I'll just say quickly before you answer that, after you answer this one, I have one more question for you, and then I would love to open it up for audience questions. So if you have a question, please send in your question in the Ask a Question function, and very excited to pose those to Julia in a minute. So go ahead.
It's been really wonderful. Like a number of the women have reached out to say how pleased they are that that they feel like what they did. So one of the things that I was going to back up here, because in order to answer the question, I want to contextualize the fact that, as we've mentioned this kind of sense that they were just doing their job, and that was the dominant perspective that many women told me. One of the things I saw that few of them put what they did into context in terms of recognizing the impact that it has had on women of our generation, in terms of our freedom to roam, to travel by ourselves or in groups of women. But they were the first group of women who traveled unchaperoned around the world, who went to Timbuktu if they wanted to, who toured ruins in Mexico on their off days, and they took full and complete advantage of their ability to travel, and I came away from this research believing very much that that really did a huge service for the women who came after, that it was kind of like the floodgates, that they opened the floodgates of women traveling and it being totally socially acceptable. So a number of them have reached out to say, yeah, we did do that, huh? Which has been really fun.
That's awesome. I mean, even in the 3 decades, between kind of when, I'm writing about the end of World War II to what you're writing about, I had the chance to write about the daughter of a prime minister and a president and an ambassador who did have access to the world in a way that was much bigger than many women, even of their class in that era, by getting to travel as their father's side, at their father's sides, as their age. So Sarah Churchill, not only at the Yalta Conference, but also the Tehran Conference. Anna Roosevelt getting to finally have her chance to be at her father's side and go all the way to the Crimea, which is exciting, but it was always in the context of traveling with their fathers. And I believe that had a woman like Sarah Churchill been born maybe 10 years later, she really could have succeeded her father in politics, which would have made her a contemporary of Margaret Thatcher, where 10 years even does make a huge difference, not let alone 30 years, what these women were able to do. And it's such a shame that we weren't able to benefit from the skills and the leadership and the potential that these women had. And so even just seeing kind of from one generation to the next, it would have been exciting to see, had Kathleen Harriman, Sarah Churchill, or Anna Roosevelt been alive and been a contemporary of the women that you're writing about. I think they would have had a lot to talk about. And I wish I could be on the fly on the wall for that pretend conversation. So I have one more question for you before we turn to the audience questions. So we have been living in a world of pretty much no travel for the last year. The world that was once so open to us had suddenly been ripped away. But now we're finally starting to see the glimmers of that, that world of traveling and experiencing different things far away from our own lives again. And there is, of course, apprehension involved in that. People don't know exactly when that will be reopened, and certain parts of the world will probably reopen to us sooner rather than others that may take a little while. But even amidst all of the concerns that we have, and we've fallen out of the habit of traveling, do you think that there's just a natural urge that people have to see the world, that when it is possible again, that desire to travel and experience new cultures will come roaring back?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think one of the things that I came to understand while researching this book is the degree to which travel and identity are so intertwined. I know I've learned a ton about myself in transit, in movement, bouncing off of these other places, and really putting myself engaging in the act of empathy that is required of you when you are going to someplace else and engaging with someone else on their cultural terms. So I think that that's something that these women also did, that they learned so much about themselves and what they wanted out of life via travel, and I think that urge doesn't go away.
Oh, that's great. I'm so excited to travel again as soon as it's possible. I wish I could have the luxury flying experience of Pan Am in its heyday. We can only go there in imagination for right now, but any kind of travel, I'm so excited. I'm hoping to get to England over the summer. As soon as that's possible, I'll be the first one there. So I definitely, I am very much in agreement with you on that. So I'd love to turn to a couple audience questions now. And the first question comes from Arlene. She asks, and you covered a little bit about the inspiration that she asks about, but what were some of the challenges that you experienced writing this book?
So one of the first challenges was I thought I had found a woman that I really wanted to write about. Broadly, one of the challenges was memory. Because this is a book that deals with human memory. Memory is deeply fallible, and it reflects a lot of what is happening in the present day in a person's life, as well as what the past actually looked like. So, and I learned that very, very keenly, very quickly, when one of the women that I was interviewing, it turned out that a bunch of what she had told me was untrue. Which was a fascinating experience, and when I was writing about her, I basically came to understand that the ways in which untruths are told to you are just as interesting as the truth itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it really made me. My policy with the book was that I was not going to publish anything that came exclusively from someone's memory. If I could find it corroborated by a newspaper or some sort of secondary source, then I would include it. Or if I could find a scene described to me by two, because a lot of these scenes were, there's a moment where one of the women in the book almost drowns in Monrovia, Liberia, and that's not something that's going to be in a newspaper. But that party was described to me the same way by two different people. So I felt comfortable including it.
Yeah, well, that is a huge part of oral history, which can be such a powerful tool, but it's also challenging because it's, and we talk about this a lot, and also at Harvard Law School, and, talking about when witnesses are giving evidence, testimony, and it's not even that they mean to tell an untruth, but just that the way they perceive things, even in the immediate aftermath, can be very different. And as time transpires and time passes, your memories change, and that's just a natural part of psychology. And so trying to find, as you say, corroborating sources, multiple writings or memories on the same event, and trying to stick as close as possible to the sources that come from the time that you're writing about as contemporaneous as possible is super important. But that is a fascinating part of this job. People think, ancient history certainly has its challenges, but telling modern, history also has its challenges because of these reflections on perception and memory as it changes over time. So that's such an interesting thing to highlight. So next question comes talking a little bit about, we think of shows like Mad Men, where stewardesses are portrayed in a glamorous way, but also kind of the pop culture image of a stewardess sometimes can be conflated with being a sex symbol. Did the women that you were writing about regularly have to deal with things that we'd now think about, that would be sexual harassment or things that just would not be appropriate, maybe glorified in pop culture? But when you're the person that's being in that situation, that is of course not acceptable and not something that should be tolerated. So what did the women you interviewed have to say about that?
Yeah, they certainly did have to deal with that in lots of different insidious and more overt ways. But it's important to keep in mind that with Pan Am, so first of all, the domestic airlines were much more overt about their sexism, and I think that played out with the passengers as well. That kind of, how much an airline was willing to objectify its stewardesses really did impact the passenger behavior on board. And it's worth keeping in mind that Pan Am, because it flew internationally into places where the sexual revolution was not happening in the same way around the world, Pan Am refrained from being as overt about its objectification of its stewardesses. And so many of its passengers were also a little bit more dignified.
Yes. So we have a question from Naomi, who is wondering, not the main protagonists that you've been writing about, because they worked earlier in the era of Pan Am, but maybe for some that you may have come across who were beginning their career towards the end of Pan Am, or working for another airline, who maybe now are more senior members working in the airline industry today. I'd love to know if anybody's still working in the industry.
Yeah, I didn't interview those people necessarily. I was really very focused on the women who had worked in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, mostly because they were the women who opened the way for the people who were then able to keep their jobs. When they began flying, they had to quit when they were married or turned 35, and these were the women who changed that legislation via both unions and lawsuits. So those women definitely exist, and men too. Men began to be hired in 1972 with more frequency. So they definitely exist, but they were not the focus of my research.
Right. So Andrea asks if she wanted to read more about the women of Pan Am, or maybe other airlines, other people associated in the airline industry. What are some other books or sources that you would recommend for people who want to learn more?
So there are a couple of books. There's one called I'm not going to remember the titles. They are on the website for the book, which is comeflytheworld.com. But I do know that there's one by a scholar named Victoria Van Tok, which focuses on the objectification of the women. There's one called Stars in the Sky by a Delta flight attendant who worked it's about the African-American pioneers of aviation, flight, both pilots and stewardesses. And then there's another one called Femininity in Flight that focuses on the unions and labor law. But there's a much better list at my website.
Great. Well, I had a quick look through some of the things at the back of your book, acknowledgments, sources, things like that. And it wasn't until I became a historian myself, I realized how valuable and interesting it is to look at, the acknowledgments, the sources that are in the back of the book. So if you haven't had a chance, definitely turn to the back. Those pages are just as important. They're there for a reason. Sometimes there are great morsels and tidbits that emerge in endnotes that an author can't fit into the main body of the story, which the things that are heartbreaking to leave out, but you want them somewhere. So sometimes they find their way into the endnotes. So if you want more information, even just me looking through your book, there's so much more in the back. So definitely take a look at those pages when you pick up the book. So we have another question. You touched on this a little bit, but I would love for you to expand on it a little bit more. Writing a book is very personal. And of course, like I said, you don't want to write yourself into the book. You try not to have a particular favorite character. There's a certain level of emotional detachment that you need to maintain as a historian. But through the process of writing a book, not only are you learning a huge amount about people and their lives and some of them, the most intimate thoughts and experiences that they've had that are really profoundly moving. But in doing so, you also learn about yourself. And I certainly had that experience writing about women who were my own age as I was writing The Daughters of Yalta. Kathleen Harriman as the youngest at 27 at Yalta. Sarah Churchill was in the middle at 30 years old. And so over the 3 years I was writing the book, I found changes in my own life in the way that I thought about the world. The maturity that one sees between 27 and 30. There's a huge amount of personal growth just with the passage of time. And also the ability to empathize with people who came before you, where you realize that the life experiences, they're similar, they resonate over time. And history is really about relationships and about human experience. And so what did writing this book tell you about yourself? And what might you have learned about yourself that was different at the end of this process compared to where you started?
It's a really interesting question. And there are two answers. Number one, I realized that one of the things that I first admired about these women was the way that, to me, they really united binaries. Like they were both feminine and feminists. They traveled a ton. Many of them also had families. They didn't seem to have to choose between those two things as much as I realized that I had, when I began to do this book, I had a lot of personal anxiety about how I would reconcile my own wanderlust with my desire to have a family. And I have looked at them many times to think about that. So that has really helped me. And I actually, in order to not project too much, I started keeping a kind of shadow document where I would write about what I would have done in one of their situations, or what I wanted to, the things that I felt like I was getting a little bit ahead of, away from their experiences and more toward my own anxieties or feelings. So I have that document, which someday maybe I'll do something with.
Well, I mean, that's something that I get asked about a lot. I'm sure you do too, about what's it going to look like to be a historian in the future. And maybe I can take the privilege, you have the privilege of using this as the last question this evening. Just kind of thinking about the field in which we write. History, it changes over time. The sources change over the time. We're far away from kind of stone tablets. You had a plethora of paper, and now you're moving into digital mediums. And so I'm always asking, what is it going to look like to be a historian down the road, where we have more data now than we ever had before, where you could really construct a person's life minute by minute, but you don't have the same kind of deep reflections on the world around you as it's, events are taking place, as you're personally impacted or moved by what you're seeing on the news or in your day-to-day life, where you had people sitting down and recording those memories in a way that they don't as much now. I, like you, have tried at certain times to record some thoughts as I go through life. Certainly, throughout the journey of this book, I took the time, more so and sometimes than others, to write down some reflections to share that with future generations. So what are your thoughts about the role of the historian and the writer in the future, and what are things that we can do now to start capturing some of those memories in a way that might be more productive for historians to really understand our thoughts and feelings later?
I don't know. It's interesting. I'm not a trained historian. I'm a journalist, and most of this book was a big departure for me in that and it's part of why it took quite some time. Most of my writing before I had been on the ground reporting. I think that this will keep happening. Like, my experience may be slightly more common in the future, as history is understood as being a living thing with perspectives that are constantly changing. It's less something that happens in rarefied realms of archives, and more something that can be engaged with via these different kinds of texts. So I think if my experience has any bearing, it's that. Yeah. And also, can I just? I want to be sure to not miss. I'm noting tons of amazing comments and stories that many of you are sharing, which I am not having a chance to read. So I would like to invite anyone who is sharing in the chats these really amazing anecdotes. Go to the Come Fly the World website. I'm hoping to collect some stories from the people that, clearly my book is only focuses on very select people. If you have stories that you want to share, or these anecdotes, please go to comeflytheworld.com, share your story, and I'm gonna highlight some of them on my social media. I'd love to. So I can't see all of these amazing stories, but I would love to.
So I've had a chance to read a few of them along the side. They are amazing. So please share the stories with Julia. I think that we will all benefit from hearing them, and it's a great way to share more hidden histories that should really be brought to light.
Thank you both so much for a fascinating evening and a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I can see from the comments our audience did too. So thank you both so much. To our audience, if you haven't purchased Come Fly the World, you can press the handy green button center of your screen. If you'd like to purchase Catherine's book, The Daughters of Yalta, I've dropped the link in the chat again. And again, thank you everyone for spending your Friday evening with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming, and thank you to Catherine.
Thanks for a great conversation. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you all. Have a good night.